15.
Our next speaker is talking about a subject that actually is very dear to our hearts, which is food. Her name is Carolyn Steel. She's an architect and author, and she has looked at how cities function through food, which is probably not a very concise way of saying it, but I will let her explain it to you in all its glory. Please welcome Carolyn Steel.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I can't believe I've managed this, but I've actually come to an event where I have to talk for precisely 15 minutes without a watch, so I'm just going to go with the flow, but my natural tendency is to take up as much time as I'm allowed, so you're going to have to be very cruel to me, Helena, as I move on. If I could have the first slide, actually, please. Now, I had an interesting dilemma when I was preparing this talk, because I was quite tempted to talk about my personal transformation, but then I thought, well, rather than focus in, why don't I focus out and talk about, the transformation of human civilization over the last 10,000 years instead. That sounds like the kind of thing you might want to do in 15 minutes. So I've gone down that route, you'll be happy to hear. Anyway, if you look at this slide, and I hope people at the back can sort of, do kind of anamorphic projection and work out what it ought to be like from where they are, or move. If you look at the slide on the left, you can see basically how 100% of humanity lived up to about 8,000 years BCE, in other words, in forests, hunting and gathering. And if you look at the slide on the right, or the picture on the right, I should say, you can see how 80% of us are going to be living by 2050. That's a kind of timeline, if you like. Next, please. Now, how do we get from A to B, or how are we getting from A to B? And the crucial missing link is the bit in the middle, otherwise known as farming. Farming, curiously, is an urban food. And thanks, Daisy. But it also leads to a paradox, because in order to feed urban populations, we have to produce food somehow, and the only food we've ever discovered that's capable of feeding an urban population is grain. So you could say grain, or the discovery of grain and the production of it through farming, is effectively what's affecting this extraordinary long-term transformation. Next, please. Now, it all began, as I said, about 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age in this area of the ancient Near East called the Fertile Crescent, so-called because it was fertile and it was crescent-shaped. And essentially, this is where I really don't have enough time to go into this, but essentially, people began to experiment with farming because all the animals were moving north and they were running out of food, effectively. Farming produces a static, predictable source of food, but you have to be near it for the moment when it ripens, hence, to cut a really long story short, cities. Next, please. Here's one of them. This is from 2000 BC. You can notice various things about it. It's quite an enigmatic plan because it's drawn when they were still excavating the place. But basically, it's very small, it's very compact, and it has a large temple complex in the middle, which was basically a sort of large spiritualized, centralized food hub, which is essentially how ancient cities worked. Next, thank you. And in fact, cities had to be compact in the pre-industrial era because not only did they have to solve the problem of how to produce enough food to feed themselves, but they also had to solve the problem of how to get the food into the city. And if we look at London, and I could have chosen obviously pretty much any other city on earth founded before roughly 1800, but you can see it's extremely compact. Peckham clearly doesn't exist yet, and it's surrounded by fields, it's surrounded by market gardens, and all the roads leading in lead to the central space here. Sorry, I normally use a laser pointer, but I thought I might blind Daisy, who's kind of the other side of the screen, so that wasn't probably a very good idea. But anyway, the food had to physically get into the middle of the city, and the city had to be compact, because that was the only place that you could buy fresh food was in the market. And obviously people had to walk to get it, so hence small, compact, and with food in the middle. Thank you. Next. And in fact, if we look at the way London's food was travelling into the city in the pre-industrial era, you can see that grain was coming up from the river because grain was heavy and bulky and difficult to transport, and meat, which was on the right. Sorry, some of the text is missing off these things, but obviously there's been some kind of technical hoo-ha, but never mind. Meat was coming in from the north because the animals were physically walking into the market. So you just have to imagine the city basically being literally physically shaped by food. Next. Animals everywhere. This is Smithfield Market in 1830, and you can just see that it would have been impossible to live in a city before the age of industrialisation and be unaware of where your food came from. Next. And markets were also places of great conviviality. They were places where people went to gather and celebrate the passing of the seasons, as in this fantastic painting from 1559 of Bruegel's fight between Carnival and Lent. Really, Carnival, Carnevale, goodbye to meat, essentially the festival that preceded Lent. Thank you. And of course, markets were also very political spaces because the food supply was the most important thing a city had to worry about, and therefore most cities like this one in the Amsterdam dumped the town hall slap bang on the marketplace simply in order to make the point that the food supply and the urban politics were essentially one and the same thing. Next, thank you. Now, this all changed when the railways came along, and it changed essentially, if you look at this early image, the Great Western in 1840, you can see it's carrying farm animals, and essentially what that meant was that food, which previously had been physically transported by oxen or horses or just simply by boat, could now be transported very, very quickly at long distances by train. Actually quite an apt space to be talking about this in, I guess. And therefore cities were emancipated from geography. This is really the beginning of the Great Transformation. Thank you. Next. So you can see London in the 70 years after the railways came, going from being a sort of dense urban blob like the ones I've been talking about to being a kind of large metropolitan splurge, technical term for somewhere you couldn't possibly serve from just one little market everybody walked to. Next. And of course, what happens here is that cities and food, which have co-evolved up to this point, so 10,000 years roughly of farming and cities and food being in the middle, now completely split apart. So you start to get industrialised foodscapes like this one in Chicago, specialised to feed the burgeoning cities and thousands of miles away from them. Next one. And of course, cars follow trains, and you just get the whole metropolitan carpet rolling out even more exaggeratedly. Next. And you start to get food not kind of arriving, mooing, bleating, and sort of announcing itself as an animal or whatever, but arriving in these bizarre cardboard boxes, with all the writing on the outside that you need a PhD to understand and so on. So food becomes denatured. Next. And of course, what's happening now is food is no longer coming into the middle of the city, it's going to the edges of cities, and people have to go out to the food. So you've got a bizarre reversal of the whole logic of urbanity. This is halfway through, so I don't know how I'm doing. Probably very, very badly. Oh, excellent. I'm going very, very fast. Next, please. Okay, so we have effectively what I call the eviscerated city. Cities where all the food's taken out, exists on the outside of the city, unless you're lucky enough to be rich and able to afford to lure a supermarket in and serve your local area. So this map of New York, for instance, all the red bits are where the poor people are, and that's where there's no food. Next. And of course, Britain, as we now know, is an obesogenic society, which means just living here makes you fat. That's my excuse anyway. Next. And actually, what we find is that we live in a food place. We live in a place that's shaped by food. And this is really something that I discovered. I should now pause and tell you a little bit about my own personal transformation, which is that I began life as an architect. Indeed, I am an architect. That's the only thing I'm trained to do. And I spent about 25 years of my life designing and teaching the design of, indeed, cities and buildings and all that kind of thing, without once thinking about food, but with a sort of vague sense that there was something missing. And, well, to cut a long story short, I mean, it rather goes back to Eileen's point, and indeed Jude's before that, which is that I came to the conclusion that what was missing was people in the architectural debate, and food really was my way of trying to put people back into the urban debate. And I now talk a lot about food, but I don't really talk about food so much as through food. I try to understand who we are, what we are, how we live, and why we live the way we do, using food as a kind of medium. So having said all of that, if I could have the next one, please. This is my sort of yet to be patented Autopian mechanism for sort of seeing the world through food. Utopia, I should say, is a word I invented. It's kind of like a sort of anti-utopia in a sense, because it struck me that, people have spent a lot of time trying to work out how we should dwell by trying to kind of imagine a perfect way of dwelling simply, and it struck me that perfect is the enemy of the good. You're never going to get there, whereas we already live in a utopia. So what would it be like if we tried to understand the world through food and transform the world through food? So this is how you do it. You get yourself a pair of pineapple ring-shaped glasses and you look at the world through food. Next. It's all about values. Now, the thing is that, again, I don't have time to really go into this in adequate detail, but if you just think about the effect of food on your daily life, obviously we all eat, probably 3 times a day and so on. We have to buy that food. It has to come somewhere. It has to be grown. It has to be transported into the city. It's been bought and sold at some point. This used to happen in markets. That used to be a sort of hugely human transaction. It now generally, as I say, happens in these kind of peopleless spaces. People actually sort of were designed out of the food system by supermarkets. That's the whole idea behind them, essentially. And so on, we eat together, we then sort of don't value the food, so we waste it and so on. So this extraordinary kind of effect that food has, both in ways that are extremely obvious to us because we all eat, so we actually physically encounter food every day, but also in many, many ways that are much more obscure. And I say it's really about food values. In other words, it's about how we eat, how we grow, whether or not we cook. As we know in this country from watching Jamie Oliver's, very, very few people now that can look at a leek and recognise it, certainly not school kids and so on. So this kind of, incredible separation that I was talking about of food and cities is now between ourselves and our most necessary and vital commodity, which is just a very, very odd thing to have happened. So basically, by thinking about what food is and through food, we can transform society. That's essentially the argument. Next, please. Now, I bought this book, Aristotle's Ethics, when I went to university because I thought it was the kind of thing that, architecture students ought to read. And I opened page 1 and thought, that looks quite hard, I'll read that later. Put it on a shelf. And 30 years went by very, very quickly. Now, what's really interesting is just very, very recently, actually, I was thinking to myself, okay, what if you were going to really try to reimagine the world through food, our most important shared thing, commodity is the wrong word really, necessity you should say, you have to ask the question, what is a good life? Because we've all got to eat. So effectively sharing food globally is like extending the kind of manners that you exercise with your friends when you're having a nice meal with them to the rest of the world. And not just to people either, but to all other creatures that have to eat. So again, going back to Eileen's point, it's a bit like this kind of, this great social, ecological blob that we exist in called the world. Now, when I got to this point, I thought, okay, so actually through food, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to ask a question of what is a good life. And I thought, didn't I once buy a book about that? Over to the shelf, blow off the dust, open it up. And it was the most extraordinary thing. And I suppose this is where, the transformation of human society starts to kind of relate to my personal transformation, because instead of being an architecture student that thought they ought to read Aristotle, I was someone with the burning question who had the same question, as it turns out, that Aristotle had 2,000 years ago. Now, he's got a better brain than I have, and better robes, probably, but and a better beard and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, I found I was actually asking exactly the same question as Aristotle was, and honestly, reading the book the second time round was like having a chat with a really, really amazing person. I was going, almost couldn't stop to make myself a cup of tea. So this is extraordinary, and what I would say is that, giving yourself permission to think through food, which is what I now do, is an incredibly enabling and empowering thing, because it's an enormous idea that's much, much bigger than you, but if you allow yourself to think through it, you actually start to ask big questions, and that's just a wonderful thing. And, I have to say it's a very connecting thing as well, and it's wonderful being in a sort of what feels like it might be a sort of either a haystack or a cowshed, talking about these sorts of issues. But, I promise you, every one of us could now have a conversation for a long time about, shared ideas about food, food stories. It really is what connects us all together. Anyway, thank you. Next. And what it also shows you is that the kind of false dichotomies that, interestingly, in a way we've inherited from Greek thinking as well, this kind of the theory of dialectic, are actually, they're just that. They're sort of artificially isolated, and they're really asking the wrong question. So this question of how should we feed the world? Should we feed it with, industrial farming systems, or should we feed it, with everybody producing their own food in their back gardens and so on, is the wrong question. Next. The correct question is, given my vision of a good life, which I've derived through food and thinking about food values and what food is, which of those systems, or many other systems that are possible, delivers me through what I call the Autopia Matrix, which is this sort of sieve-looking object, which is also sort of patent pending. Which one actually gives you the vision of a good life that you've got? Now, if you happen to think, as I do, that it's wrong for a food system to be eviscerated of people and there should be more people and not fewer in the food system, that gives you a clue about which of these two paradigms I happen to believe in. And by the way, we can feed the world organically. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. In fact, we absolutely can't feed it industrially, because simply 50 years down the road or something, there won't be any soil or any land left or any water, and there won't be any oil, as we know. Next. Now I'm coming sort of swiftly to the end, but just to say that if we're going to start to transform the food system, and by the way, when I talk about the food system, I'm talking about life. Food is life. You can't talk about food without talking about life, and you can't talk about life without talking about food, so there you are, they're symbiotically connected. One of the really key things we've got to do is to understand that having a food system that looks like the one on the left, which ours currently does, which is basically an analysis of the number of people producing food, that's at the top, the number of people consuming it at the bottom. This is a study done on 6 European countries. They're separated, 3 million producers and 160 million consumers in 6 European countries are separated from one another by 110 supermarket buying desks. So this is an entirely monopolistic system. Now, if you think, control of food as, all those old wise kind of city fathers did in ancient days, that the food supply is actually quite important, and therefore you really ought to control it democratically, or, whatever form of politics they had at the time probably wasn't democracy, apart from vanishing these small parts of Athens for tiny shrinking amounts of time. Basically, it's a social issue, and it has to be the core of everything you do. I just find it interesting that the diagram on the right, which is a semi-lattice, which came out of a very famous essay written in 1965 by an architect and mathematician called Christopher Alexander, called "The City is Not a Tree," in which he was saying you can't design cities as kind of, pinball machines where people will kind of live in one place and all travel to work on one system and then all go and play somewhere else. And it was a critique of zoning, effectively, and it just amuses me that the thing on the left looks like a tree. So if we have the next slide, that'll tell you everything I think we need to change in the food system. You can't have a social, interwoven, democratic society and a monopolistic, despotic food system. One is not fit for purpose to the other, so we have to address this. I'm now going to wind up. The next slide, please. And this is my final slide, my favourite slide, which I always save till last, which is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Allegory of the Effects of Good Government, which tells you everything you need to know about where we need to go. Siena in 1338, the city and the countryside, and the symbiotic relationship between the two. And my question and my challenge, really, that I'd like to share with all of you is, if we're going to move forward into a better, more equitable, more sustainable system through food, what would an allegory of the effects of good government look like today? So working through food, I think we could get to a much better world, and I hope we can do it together. Many thanks indeed.